Welcome back, everyone. If you have not already listened to podcast one of this series, please go back to our YouTube channel and search the titles, and you'll be able to find the first podcast in this series of four on accountability. Today, we're going to talk with Dr. Tanya Miller, owner and founder of TYM Coaching, and Cindy Kraft and Sherry Teague, owners and founders of K&K Healthcare Solutions. And today's topic is conflict resolution. As we discussed on the last podcast, when you have change, often accompanying that is some level of conflict. So, Tanya, do you want to get us started on ideas and advice for conflict resolution around change?
Sure. So when we're talking about conflict resolution, we need to think about the different types of conflict resolution or conflict that exist and how we approach the conflict. And I'm going to spend time, of course, because we're talking about OASIS right now. So I really want to talk about that world of where the conflict usually arises when we have new regulatory changes. And it's between the individuals that are reviewing the documentation and making sure everything is correct in alignment with the regulation and the frontline team members. And this environment is really set up to be a challenge, first of all, because how do we mostly communicate between those individuals? It's usually between email or some type of messaging. So anytime that technology is involved, we set ourselves up for a little bit extra risk of conflict. And then we have two different goals. One's out seeing patients, one's out looking at documentation. Very different worlds that they're in. So we set up an environment where conflict is more likely anyway. And then how do we usually try to resolve it? Unfortunately, we usually take the worst approach and the approach that we should use least often, which is directive. This is wrong, you need to fix it. The least effective way to resolve conflict is to tell people how to do something and to make them do it. You should only use that when the house is burning down. So when you have a fire, it's okay to yell, get out of the house. But when you have a documentation change that's needed, you should start off by telling somebody it's wrong and to change it. So that's how we start off, and then it just snowballs from there. There's some other forms of conflict resolution, and we're going to talk a little bit about them throughout this, but just think about, I want you to start how many times, if you are a reviewer, if you read documentation as a supervisor or as a QA person and you're listening to this, think about how many times you've just told somebody to do something and really think about what does that say to the person at the other side? Is the house really on fire? So let's just kind of start there and think about that. Cindy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think part of it, though, is as a reviewer, there's also a level of frustration that says, what do I do when I have a clinician that I have tried to provide information to in other ways, and I either get no response or they agree. This is a classic thing I hear, Tanya, from reviewers is my clinicians, we don't have a problem with conflict resolution. I make the changes and they always agree with me. And it's like, okay, but how many times do they keep making the same error then? Oh, all the time. But I just keep correcting it and they keep fixing it. So I'm not giving them a directive, like you said, and I agree. This kind of top down, I know it, you did it wrong, you fix it. But what would your thoughts be on a variant of that that just says, I make the correction and they always agree. This must mean we have no conflict in our organization.
So what you have is you have a sense of apathy because of the wrong type of conflict resolution that's been used over and over again. And that's the other one is negotiation. And this is where people oftentimes think, well, we negotiated. Negotiation is a good type of conflict resolution. The problem with negotiation is that everybody gives up something. In this situation that you just described here, the QA reviewer just gives up trying to teach somebody. They just make the change. And the clinician, they've given up their autonomy and they're thinking about it. They're just doing what somebody else tells them. Both parties feel bad when you constantly give up something. So that negotiation that happened, yeah, you resolve the conflict, but now you have a bigger problem because nobody feels like they're winning. They never came to a solution to understand each other's perspective and to come out with a better overall understanding from the what you're supposed to do with OASIS or whatever regulation it is, what you're supposed to understand and do, and the perspective of how you work in the field and treat your patients. So now you have apathy because you've had too much negotiation.
Well, but Tanya, I think sometimes, again, as a reviewer, and I've been a reviewer for years, you can kind of, lean into that space and say, well, the clinician makes these errors or the clinician does this. But also being on the clinician side of this, I think one of the challenges that is ubiquitous within this conflict is getting different information from different reviewers. So I understand that my organization has a group of individuals, whether they're internal or external, that has been deemed proficient, and they're essentially the authorities about checking my work to make sure it's correct. Now, what happens if I have one of them tell me this was the right answer, and then the other one tells me something different? We see a lot of this. Organizations tend to put a lot of, effort into, the clinician understanding and the clinician presenting challenges. But Sherry and I ask folks all the time, when is the last time you reviewed your reviewers? Because if they're not consistent, if they're not the most current, what does that do to that kind of conflict resolution if now one party doesn't necessarily trust, I'm just going to say it, trust the level of knowledge of the person who's telling me to make a change? Because if you guys on a team aren't consistent, then who really does know what the right answer is? So I'm just digging my heels in on what I think it is, because I'm not sure what you guys are doing over there.
So, Cindy, you brought up the perfect word, and it's trust. So, how do you have conflict resolution that creates a world of trust that you're learning and growing from each other's perspective? That's the true type of conflict resolution that we always want. Problem with that type of conflict resolution, it takes time and it takes effort. So we're all busy. So we go to the easy defaults of directive and negotiation, which ends up causing cultural challenges within your organization. So that scenario where have you checked your reviewers and when do you tell that they're proficient? That's one step in the process. But the next step of the process is bringing everybody together to learn each other's perspectives. I would say, when is the last time the reviewer had eyes on a patient? Has a reviewer been out seeing patients? Have they been working together? And it might not be a possibility that your reviewer can have eyes on the patients. We understand different job roles, but that doesn't mean they can't see the patients through the eyes of the clinician. So having a Zoom call or sitting down in an office in the good old fashioned way around the table. Let's talk about this case in particular. Here's why I thought it should be scored this way in OASIS. Tell me what you saw in the home and let's make a connection together. Now you have an outcome that's collaborative and we all come to agreement about what that answer should be. Plus, we've learned from each other's perspectives. That takes time, and I realize you can't do that with every single OASIS change. But is that ever a great interaction?
What I would add to that, Tanya, is that I've been accused on more than one occasion of sleeping with that OASIS manual under my pillow. But for over 20 years, the words that stuck in my head was from one of the original developers of the tool that said, sometimes the correct answer is 2.5. And I've tried to infuse that into this conflicting situation to say, there are going to be more than an isolated occasion where the 4 response options or 6 response options that I have, my patient does not ideally land in one of them. And I think that's where, when the culture around this is your answer is wrong, I try to stay away from that and say, what is the best possible answer of the ones we've been given? And sometimes it's not the perfect. And I think a job in that collaboration is to acknowledge it's not the perfect answer, but following the official guidance, looking at what our options are, this is the best place, feels way more collaborative to me than that top down, because it also gives the perception that there is always a right answer. And sometimes there's just a best answer. And it's not a perfect system, and CMS knows that, but I think we've turned it into, there's a right answer and you were wrong, when in many cases the clinician is just frustrated because they're looking at a patient and they don't really fit these answers. They don't like the answers that they have to choose from. So they're uncomfortable with putting a patient in there in one of those boxes and feeling like they're not being completely truthful.
And Cindy, I'm just going to echo what you're saying. I wanted to just butt in here. As a former agency owner, sometimes the agency has to take a stand and they have to set a policy about how they're going to answer one of those items when it falls into that 2.5 range. Agencies set policies and procedures for just about everything that goes on, and having that collaborative conversation between the frontline clinician and the review clinician, that they're going to come to an agreement that maybe this needs to go to a policy decision by the agency, that we answer this question in this way. However, like you said before, and I'm going to echo it, just what you just said, the third person in that conflict resolution is not a person. It's the manual. It's the rules under which we play the home health game. And those rules are set by CMS. They're not set by the agency finitely, meaning that the agency can have those nuances of those questions that fall in between. However, the manual and the guidance is the ultimate ruler. And I think that sometimes can take some of the pressure off the individual humans that are sitting in that room. When they both get frustrated, they're not necessarily frustrated with each other. Sometimes they're frustrated with what the rules are and how that document is answered. And I think without those face-to-faces that Tanya mentioned, you're not going to come to that conclusion. You're not going to come to that almost realization that can build a bond, that, hey, we're not necessarily fighting each other. We're fighting this frustrating rule. And figuring out a way that you can address that rule that can be consistent. I think that's magic. I think that's where you can almost come to those bonds that can be unbreakable. But if you never sit down, either virtually or in person, and have those lengthy conversations over certain situations that you may be seeing trends over, then you'll never know. Sometimes you never even know that there's a conflict. Sometimes that those conflicts are held in until there's just a tiny thing that can break the camel's back. And that leads me into professionalism and personal accountability once again. I think that we sometimes get away from talking about our professional obligations, and knowing that when we say things, sometimes you can't unsay them. If you send a harshly worded email or text in the heat of the moment, it's really tough to wind that back down. Tanya, can you address that when we get to those situations?
Sure. And I want to bring up something that both you and Cindy said. You gave different examples, like directives from the OASIS manual, and sometimes it's 2.5. Although collaboration is the best form of conflict resolution, it takes time and energy. There are times when directive, like the OASIS manual says X, and it's very clear that we have to use directive. And there are times where we might just negotiate. The problem is that if you use those types of negotiation, those conflict resolution styles all the time, you create a problem in your culture. So you have to blend it with collaboration. So now, building off of what you just said, Sherry, about that professionalism and that engagement. Couple little things with conflict resolution and reducing conflict within your organization. In my leadership roles, I have a 3 email rule. If you go back and forth about something in 3 emails and it is not resolved, you need to stop that email interactions. Technology is a wonderful thing, but in overuse, just like anything else, I love chocolate, but if my entire diet was chocolate, I'd be in trouble. I would love for my entire diet to be chocolate, but I would be in big trouble. So just like chocolate, email should be used in small moderation, not as your only form of communication. Same way with text. You have to pick up the phone and have conversations. You have to talk to each other. And I know we hide behind our technology, but put a rule in your organization. You go back and forth 3 times, pick up the phone. You could resolve that conflict so much quicker if you just had the conversation.
That is such a fantastic advice, Tanya. And Cindy, again, both of you, thank you so much for taking this topic head on. However, sometimes we know that conflict can arise from complaints. And oftentimes different personalities and different folks do not want to address conflict, or they're not comfortable in conflict. And so, the issues that may arise during change can go straight to a complaint. And so our next podcast in our series of 4 is on complaint management. That's a fun topic. And we're going to be putting this in a series of 4. The first one is accountability. The second one is conflict resolution, which is this one, and then complaint management. So if you need any additional information between now and the next one that you're able to listen to, please reach out to us at www.valuebeyondthevisit.com for any OASIS e-education options. And if you need to have help with your culture building, with your teamwork, with your vision of how you're going to lead in your agency, please reach out to Dr. Miller at tymcoaching.com. And you won't regret that reach, let me tell you. If you have any other questions, please come back to the next one in our series of 4 on complaint management. Thank you.